Welcome to the Copeland Coaching Podcast, where it's all about turning your job search into a slam dunk. Your host is Angela Copeland.
Welcome to the Copeland Coaching Podcast. I'm your host, Angela Copeland. Live on the phone with me today, I have Catherine Peyrols Wu in Singapore. Catherine is a teacher, trainer, facilitator, and mentor with a background in human resources. She's currently the Director of Programs at the Center for Leadership and Cultural Intelligence at the Nanyang Technological University. She's also completing her PhD in Organizational Behavior. For the past 6 years, Catherine has been studying the topic where cultures meet. Specifically, she's learned how to orchestrate multicultural work environments to draw the benefits of cultural diversity and to facilitate rewarding intercultural collaborations. Catherine, thanks for joining me today.
Thank you. Thank you, Angela.
We were just talking before we got started, and it's been, I think, about 3 years since we've spoken. I actually visited you in Singapore 3 years ago.
Yeah, that's right. I remember very well.
I think we actually had conversations about this very topic when I was there visiting you. So I'm really excited to have you.
Yeah, me too. Thank you.
Well, so it's a really interesting topic, and I'm curious, how did you get interested in sort of learning about cultural differences and how they work together?
Well, I've always been fascinated by the fact that people who grew up in different parts of the world had different ways to do things and to see the world and to think about things in general. And somehow I got to live in different countries, and many years ago, actually, I moved to China and realized that beyond the differences, I was not very good at figuring out how to bridge those differences, and I wanted to learn more about this. Understanding the differences is not easy, but it's feasible. It's possible to do. But understanding what we can do to work better with our colleagues who are different, who have different backgrounds, different nationalities, but not necessarily. It can be different cultural ethnicity, it can be different sexual orientation, even different age groups, require a little bit more than just understanding them and knowing that we are different. And so that brought me to Singapore, to the Center of Cultural Intelligence, to study exactly what can we do to help people work better with those who are culturally different from them.
Yes. And it's a great point that you make about it's more than just the being from a different region. You know, I speak to people every day who have concerns about working with younger colleagues, for example, and the issues that they're facing there. So I think you're right. There are a lot of facets to it. So I'm curious, you mentioned that you moved to China some time ago. Where have you lived in the world? You've lived in a number of different countries. Where did you grow up, and where did you move since then?
So I grew up in France. I spent most of my childhood in France, and then as soon as I had the chance, I moved to England as an exchange student. I was in England for a year, and that was an amazing experience for the first time in my life, living in an English-speaking country and not being able to communicate freely the way I had been used to in my mother tongue was a great experience, and I wanted to renew it, and I wanted to challenge myself. So when I graduated from my business school, my master program, I moved to China, to Beijing, where I spent almost 5 years before moving to Singapore about almost 7 years ago.
Wow, that's so interesting. That's great. So you're the perfect person to be studying this topic. Well, in your perspective, why are multicultural work environments so important? I mean, why can they be a positive thing?
I'm not even sure that today we can ask why they are important or not important, because they are the reality, they are the default. Most workplaces are multicultural by definition, by nature, simply because the world is diverse And nowadays, you may think, when you talk about multicultural environment, your work environment, you may think of multinational organizations where you have colleagues from Singapore and America and France. But even within your own country, even if you don't leave your country, you may also already be in a multicultural work environment, because people come from different backgrounds. There's a lot of migration around the world. There's a lot of people moving from one country to another one, from one region to another one. Even within a country, people come from diverse cultural backgrounds. Think about the United States, that has a huge population that is of Hispanic background, people who are bilingual. And even already when people can speak multiple languages, they already acquire certain ways from this different culture that make them. And even without going down to the ethnicity or the cultural nationality definition of multicultural may also mean people, as I said earlier, of different age groups, different gender, different sexual orientation, different religions. All these are defined, or definitions also, of different layers of culture, and make us for multicultural work environment. So nowadays, I want to say multicultural environments are the norm, and what's important is not to have them. What's important is to consciously shape them so that we can extract the benefits of them. And we know today that when we are exposed to more diversity, more diverse point of views, diverse perspectives, this has a number of benefits for people in general. I mean, it gives a diversity of perspective to address specific problems. So if there is more diversity, people can come up with more creative solutions because they have different lenses to look at the same problem.
Mm-hmm. I absolutely agree with you. I think it's really well said that the reason that it's important is that it's a reality. It's not something to seek out. It is what we're facing. That's very, very true. Well, from your perspective, are there certain regions in the world where this topic is more pertinent than other regions, or is it something that's sort of universal?
Yes. So my perspective is that it's universal. At least that's what I think and what I see. It's universal in the sense that even if your workplace is not very diverse, oftentimes your customers are diverse, your business partners are diverse. So diversity exists everywhere and anywhere, and there is no place in the world, in my opinion, that needs more or less of the skills to deal with this diversity. I think it's a universal skill. These are universal skills that would benefit anyone who is, a professional who is living and reaching out and connecting and working with people any place in the world. Yeah.
I totally agree. I think your point about the fact that even if your work environment may not be terribly diverse, your customer base may be very diverse. I think that's a really good point. Well, another area that I know that you focus on is actually orchestrating multicultural work environments in order to really, get the benefits of the cultural diversity and to kind of facilitate rewarding intercultural collaborations. And so given that, I'm wondering what tips that you might share with us on how to get the biggest benefit from that multicultural work environment.
Yeah, I think it starts, at least from an individual perspective, I think it starts from understanding that as human beings we have an innate tendency to be attracted by those who are similar to us, those who speak like us, the same accent, the same language, who have the same ways of doing things, who see the world the same way as we do. And this natural tendency takes us apart from those who are fundamentally different in the way they see the world, in the way they work, in the way they approach problems. And that creates further the divide that makes diversity difficult it makes it difficult to get the benefits of diversity. So I think for me, the tip I can give anyone is to, instead of sticking to what is similar, to what is comfortable, try to be interested. Reach out to people who are somehow different from us, one way or another. Talk to them, ask them questions, and it helps understand that every human being is beyond the surface, beyond the box where we tend to put everyone in. There is an individual, there's an individual story, a personal, an identity, a history, and almost everybody has something to bring to the table, and the way to bridge the differences is really to understand them, to go beyond the assumptions, the stereotypes that we may have about one person or another, and more importantly, beyond the fear that we instinctively have of those that we sense one way or another to be different from us. So I want to say, the first step is really this. It's really approaching people, asking questions, trying to understand them, their culture, their religion, their personal story. How do you do things in your culture? Why do people of your religion do this and that? In a non-judgmental way, trying to be interested. And I think that's the first step to integrate this diverse workforce and to facilitate these connections, this relationship that are so essential for getting the most out of this diversity. Because if you think about it, when we do not talk to people who are different from us, we also miss all these chances to build a relationship, to build a social connection that later on makes it easy for us to, pick up the phone when we have a question and ask our colleague, share certain problems that we may have at work and try to get the perspective of others. If we don't have a social connection, a personal relationship with the people we work with, we cannot do this, and this ultimately, damage or hinders our effectiveness at work. Hinders the benefits of our performance, or what we can achieve with the people we work with.
Mm-hmm. I completely agree. I think from meeting me that I have quite an interest in different cultures, and I've had people ask me, how do you know so much about this culture or that culture? And I think over the years, it has come, just like you said, from being curious and asking questions. And when you do that, people are interested to share. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you are an amazing example. Yes, I mean, being interested, being somehow, taking putting on the hat of a naive observer,
mm-hmm.
just being curious like your child would be, when they approach you and they ask you, why is this like this and why is this like that, instead of shying away from asking those questions, go and ask them. I think this is an amazing way to learn and to get a deeper insight, and also a more personal insight. I think nowadays, these days in the world, we have a lot of negative biases and negative stereotypes towards a certain group of people. And assuming that we know everything about them, about their culture, does not get us very far. Instead, it tends to reinforce those negative feelings and those fears. So a better way is to just, ask questions.
Mm-hmm.
Be interested. People love to talk about themselves. They love to talk about their culture and the things that matter to them.
It's true. And I think sometimes when you take the time to get to know someone and understand those differences, you may discover that you actually have similarities with the person that you may not have expected otherwise.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah.
Well, I'm also very excited because, as I mentioned in the introduction, you're completing your PhD, and your dissertation, is about the role of English, self-efficacy, and cultural intelligence for intercultural avoidance in interpersonal work dyads. And so first, can you help us to understand, kind of in layman's terms, tell us about what is it that you're studying for your dissertation?
So I'm exactly studying that. Intercultural avoidance is I was interested to know why people will avoid contact, talking to their colleagues. Obviously, if you think about the workplace, you can never avoid people completely, because you have to have meetings, you have to have brainstorming sessions, you have to talk to your colleagues on a regular basis. But there is still a whole area where you don't really have to. You don't have to go to lunch with your colleagues. If you meet them in the hallway or at the coffee machine, in the bathroom, you don't have to talk to them. You don't have to stop and say hi. On Monday morning, you don't have to stop by their desk and ask them about their weekend. You don't have to do all this. But I also know that this kind of what we call like social interactions, this type of interactions that are not related to work, that are not required by, to get your job done, they are also very important, because they build the social connection, the social bond that later on allow you to feel comfortable approaching your colleagues or asking them for advice, seeking feedback from them. So I was interested to study that. It's like in multicultural environment where people from different cultures work together, why are they more likely to avoid this smaller social interactions in the workplace? And from my personal experience, I think there are two things that complicate those intercultural relationships. One is language, and that's why I study English self-efficacy. As I told you before, when I was an exchange student in England in my early 20s, and it was the first time in my life that I live in a country that doesn't speak French. French is my mother tongue. Mm-hmm. And I can tell you, speaking English was nerve-wracking. Mm-hmm. I had work groups where everybody was a native speaker, and it was really overwhelming for me. And so if my classmates or my friends had asked me to, go to lunch, or I would just say no, I would just avoid them, because I was so scared of, looking stupid, saying something wrong. I mean, all the fear that come to you when you are not fluent, not comfortable speaking a language. The second thing that I noticed may also influence this interaction or this avoidance is the culture. I mean, fundamentally, we come from different parts of the world, and this has shaped the way we approach certain situations. Different cultures have different values. They care about different things. They have different solutions to different problems. They communicate differently. And in different parts of the world, these different communication styles may be perceived negatively. When I was in China, for example, I had a colleague who all of a sudden stopped talking to me. And we used to go to lunch together, as a matter of fact, and then all of a sudden she just stopped, and she could find any excuse not to be around me. And it happened that I had offended her, because, well, obviously the way I communicate was maybe a little too direct for her, and I had given her feedback that was mostly was supposed to be constructive feedback. At least in my mind, it was constructive feedback helping her, but she took it as a criticism, and she was offended by it. And these are fundamental differences that exist between people who have different upbringing, different backgrounds, that can really damage the relationship and make it difficult for people to want to spend more time with with other people. So my dissertation was about that. It was about looking at how language or communication through language in a language that people are not fully comfortable, and also those different cultural differences influence our tendency to want to spend time with the people we work with outside of work. So English self-efficacy in layman terms is the confidence to communicate in English, or the confidence to communicate in any language that is not your mother tongue, as a matter of fact. I mean, I study English because English is the main communication language all around the world between people who have different mother tongue, but it could be any language. I mean, think if you travel to South America and you know a little bit of Spanish, then Spanish may be, your confidence to speak Spanish may also influence your relationship with the people that are around you. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And cultural intelligence is the skill, the capability that people have to be effective, to work well with people who are diverse. So in that work, I look at how these two specific characteristics of individuals influence avoidance, and how can they actually reduce those behavior those avoidance behavior. And the main takeaway of my dissertation is that people still avoid, even when they are very confident in the language, or if they are competent to deal with the culture. The only situation where people would not be motivated to avoid those interactions, will in fact be interested to reach out to other people, is when they are both competent to communicate in the language, so they don't worry about looking silly or saying something wrong or offending other people because they cannot understand what others are saying. And they are also culturally intelligent. They also have the skill to pick up this, to understand the different ways of doing things, the different ways of seeing the world in different cultures, and they have the capability to create strategies to reconcile those or to bridge those different ways of doing things, instead of trying to impose one way or totally adapting to another way.
Wow, that's very interesting.
So the conclusion is that both the confidence to communicate in the language and the capability to deal with the culture are essential, and only people who have these two capabilities are the ones who don't really need to avoid those informal interactions at work, and who actually can get, and the implication is that these people are the ones who can get the most out of these interactions, who will learn from their colleagues from different backgrounds, who will be able to to get the most out of these diverse perspectives.
So that's fantastic. So, and I'm thinking back to when we spoke 3 years ago. I may remember this a little wrong, so correct me. But I feel like we had a conversation where we talked about the importance of confidence when you're speaking. And I feel like you may have said that even if your English, for example, is not as good as someone else's, if you are the more confident person between the two people, even though maybe your skill level is lower, but the confidence may be higher, that outsiders perceive you more positively as the more confident person than as maybe the person with the better language skills who is less confident. Is that right? Or I'm maybe imagining that?
I think this is more on the perceiver perspective, so how people perceive others. It is true. What I found in my research is that competence and confidence are not the same thing. So you can be very competent but not very confident. And if you are very competent but not very confident, you will be more silent. It will be harder for you to speak up because of all these worries that we have about. Well, we are not confident. We tend to worry a lot. We worry about the judgment of others. We worry about saying something wrong, making mistakes. And this is why confidence is so important. And this is why people who have confidence and not necessarily very advanced competence, they may be perceived more positively. Fundamentally, it's because if you're more confident, you will speak more. You will communicate more, and eventually your competence will improve, because to improve competence, you have to practice more. I would say that your point is right, that the perception of others is a lot influenced by, it's influenced a lot by the confidence that you display, provided that you have enough competence that people can actually understand you. But if your competence is sufficiently good, even if making mistakes here and there, at the end of the day, it's not as important. What's important is that you speak up, you communicate with others, and eventually the confidence will also build up with more practice.
Well, so speaking of communication and learning to communicate really well, you're actually a big supporter, I think, of Toastmasters. And I'm curious, is that what got you involved in Toastmasters, was the speaking element? What was the attraction for you?
Yeah. Actually, I was a Toastmaster for 2 years back in China. So that was before starting doing research and working on my dissertation.
Okay.
I am a big fan of Toastmasters. I've been really impressed by what I have seen, what this organization can accomplish. I think what Toastmaster is really working on the confidence part, especially for people who are not native English speakers, like me, or like when I was in China, most of my colleagues or my friends there were also not, English wasn't their first language. So Toastmaster has this amazing effect to really give people an outlet to practice and to build this confidence, to speak in front of a group of people, And I've seen this in action a lot here in Singapore, because I've been a volunteer for an organization that work with migrant workers. And one of the classes that we offer is built on the model of Toastmasters. And even for migrant workers who also come from countries that, for them, English is also not their first language, but going through the process of Toastmasters, of learning to speak in front of a group, learning to actually exhibit this confidence, also end up building their confidence. And this we have measured. I measured this in my research, and I found that there is very strong evidence of an improvement in the confidence to communicate in English through the Toastmasters program.
I love that. I mean, I think it's very helpful. Yeah, it's very helpful, I think, even for some people who, even if English is their first language, just to learn to be more confident and present their ideas, more clearly. I think it can be very helpful for anyone in a professional, capacity.
I absolutely agree with you. And I wanted to say also that even for native speakers, Toastmaster is great because of the emphasis that is placed on speaking clearly, so that people can understand you. And I think this is especially important when we work with people from diverse backgrounds, especially with people for whom English is not the first language, or who are not very confident to communicate in English. Communication is a two-way street, so it's not just about one person can talk and the other one cannot. Even when we are native speakers, the ability to speak, to change the way we speak so that others who are not fully comfortable with the language can understand us I think is also an essential skill. Things as simple as speaking a little bit slower, enunciating a little more, even changing your accent slightly so that it's easier for others to pick up the words. And I think this applies not only to communication with second language speakers, but if you think about English as a language, there are such a wide variety of accents and different type of pronunciations in different parts of the world. In the U.S., already within the U.S., there's a lot of diversity. And if you think about native speakers from other parts of the world, and even if you're a native speaker, it's not always easy to pick up certain accents. So this ability to think about the way we speak and to shape it in a way so that others can understand it better, because they don't come from the same place as we do, is also essential, even between people who are native and fully competent in the language. Yeah.
Yes. I think it's also nice, this is just my personal perspective, but if you're speaking with someone who, say, English is not their native language, and maybe they use an expression that's not completely accurate, but what they mean, I think it's best to not correct the person if you know what they mean, and just keep talking, because it seems that the more comfortable the person feels talking to you, the easier it is for them to speak in a language that is not their native language, versus if you're trying to correct them and interject into what they're saying to you, I think it makes them kind of uncomfortable, and it makes them want to withdraw a little bit if you're sort of in that position.
Yeah, you're right. This has to do with anxiety and stress. Every time you correct a person, she feels more stressed, and it becomes harder to think clearly. and harder to speak clearly, and so on and so forth. It's a negative cycle. But you're right. By encouraging people to talk, and mainly without with like stopping you for correcting them, eventually people will improve. I mean, they may not improve in the conversation with you, but your conversation with that person may be a chance for this person to pick up new words, new expressions, and again, like improve their own skill by acquiring, refining the way they speak in the language. So in the long run, yes, you are helping them build their confidence and fundamentally build their competence.
Absolutely. Well, so the other thing that you have going on that's really interesting to me is you teach a course that's called Cultural Intelligence at Work. And for those of us who are listening, can you help us to understand what is cultural intelligence exactly?
Yes. So as I mentioned earlier, cultural intelligence is defined as the capability to work effectively in culturally diverse environments. So it's a concept. Cultural intelligence is a skill. It's a competence. It's something that you do that facilitates interactions with others, that facilitates collaboration with other people. So it's a multidimensional concept that starts from the motivation. Culturally intelligent people are motivated to learn about other cultures. They are interested. They are people like you, Angela, for example, who ask a lot of questions, who want to learn more, who are drawn to working with people who have different backgrounds, different way of doing things. They just like it. They just love it. They find it intrinsically rewarding. And these people tend to acquire more knowledge. They tend to become more knowledgeable about different cultures. Why people only in Mexico do things a certain way, why people in America do things differently, and so on and so forth. They build a repertoire of knowledge in their mind to explain why people from different culture, different backgrounds, they do things differently. They have answers to these questions. But cultural intelligence is also a dynamic capability. It's not just about knowing and reading a lot of books or talking to a lot of people. It's also being able, during an interaction where you are actually talking to someone, being able to pick up cues, signals that tell you that something is not going right, or maybe we are talking about something, but the person is not understanding it the way I am understanding it. So it's the ability to be also fully aware as the interaction unfolds, so that you really sense when something is not going as expected, and then you can change, you can adjust your strategy. And it's also about being able to change your behaviors. In order to use new behaviors that are more effective. Like earlier I was saying about changing the way you speak, for example. When you're talking to someone and you notice that they don't understand what you're saying because maybe you speak a little too fast or your pronunciation is not so clear, then cultural intelligence is also this ability to modulate, to change, to flex your behaviors, the way you talk, but also your body language, even as broad as whether you should arrive on time or whether you should arrive late, because in some culture people have different expectations about time, right? So this is all about cultural intelligence. It's about knowing these differences and being able to change the way or to adapt your strategy so that you can have a better outcome. Like if you are someone who is always late and you're going to meet someone who is always on time, then, how do you adjust so that you can still meet eventually?
Yes, that's such a funny example. That I have friends from all over the world, and
yes,
for years I would host parties and everyone would arrive, 15 minutes late or so, and I would expect that, and it would give me time to prepare, and it was very nice.
Yeah.
And then one day I started dating someone from Germany, and we would have parties and his friends would come like 15 minutes early. And I was always
Yeah.
so surprised because I was not ready yet. Maybe my clothes were not all together, or the food wasn't out. And they also tended to be very, very direct. And I actually remember someone coming for a party, and they were very early, and I did have the beers laid out in the kitchen for the party, and this person walked right in, being very early, and walked right in and pointed at the beers and said, "I do not like those beers." And I remember being just shocked, because not only are you early and I really am not prepared for you, but now you're telling me very directly that you do not like the food that I am putting out for everyone.
Yeah.
But it was a big change. It was a big, big change.
Yeah, and I can imagine that your first reaction was to think, wow, this person is so rude, right?
Well, it did take me...
No, and sorry, please.
No, it did take me some time, because I was... The arriving early thing was what really surprised me the most. I just didn't... I didn't know how to handle that in the beginning. I didn't... Because it kept happening. Like, the first few times I thought it was just a mistake, or there was an accident that they happened to be early, and then I realized at some point, no, they will always be early. And you just have to be prepared.
So what did you do in the end?
I got to where I would get ready earlier so that I could be a better host, and be prepared for people to come early and for people to come late, and to be flexible to both. But I think just being ready with that information, was very, very helpful. But I do think having this interest in other cultures, it is surprising how much you personally and professionally can get out of it. I mean, for me, one of my favorite cultures I find really interesting is in India. And I have a number of friends who are from India. And I'm trying to think, maybe a few years ago, I went to India for the wedding of one of my colleagues from Pepperdine. And it was incredible. And I got to go to some ceremonies that were just for the family. But because we'd come so far, they invited us in on sort of these private moments that were separate from the larger, ceremony. And I think it's just being open and being curious, and it opens up those doors. And I think there's a lot more to it than just getting to know someone. I think there's a lot more benefits that you don't initially calculate when you're asking those questions.
Yeah, exactly. You're right, and that is a sign that your cultural intelligence is there, and that's, like you say, it's not just about talking to people and learning about their culture, but in the process, you also develop this ability to create those new strategies, new way of thinking about situations that you would have never thought of before. You've met people who challenge your own point of view to start with. Yeah.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I think, too, when you learn about cultures and you meet a lot of people from different cultures, you can start to notice patterns that can help you to even probably work more effectively with one another, when you meet someone new from that same culture.
Yeah. Yes, that is true. Yeah. Now, one thing we have to be careful about is not to generalize.
Yes.
When you give the example of your German friend, for instance.
Yes.
For instance, I also have German friends, and they are not all of them are 15 minutes early. So we also have to, cultural intelligence is also about that. It's also being able to come up with general rules and then adapt them to specific situations and to specific individuals, because not everybody within a culture follows the stereotypes that we develop about them. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. I totally agree. I think it's especially true for people who have moved and who themselves have who've been exposed to other cultures as well. I mean, everyone is different in their preferences, but it kind of leads me into the next question, which is you actually did a dissertation for your master's degree that was about expatriate training in international companies. And I'm curious, what kinds of training do companies offer?
So the type of training that usually offers by companies, so this is for people being relocated overseas.
Mm-hmm.
I would say many companies, or most companies, will usually provide relocation assistance or support, very practical training on how to find a place to live, how to find a job for the spouse, the school for the children, and all that. So this is one type of service that are usually offered by organizations. Then when people relocate overseas, typically they will have other form of training, more cultural training. So it can be about the do's and don'ts of the culture, some cultural overview, really looking at the knowledge part, really imparting knowledge about a particular culture. And there may also be some training about the language, although we know that to learn a language sufficiently to be able to be conversant takes more than a few hours before departure. It usually takes more investment once you get into the country, and then constant practice. But these are typically the type of training that are offered by organizations when they send people overseas. Now, these training are important because they build some form of awareness to start. Mm-hmm. The role is to highlight the fact that everything you know from where you come from may not work in that new place. What's, however, missing from a lot of this training is if you only focus on the do's and don'ts, people get the wrong impression that if I just follow those do's and don'ts, if I go to America and I should shake people's hand instead of kissing them in the cheek like we do in my culture, it's nice, but it's not going to get me very far. Because it addresses really the superficial level of the culture where we can see what is somehow obvious and easy. It does not go so deep at looking at the different mindset, the different values, and more importantly, the strategies. What can we do to adapt to these different values? Right? Again, if I come to the example of that you gave earlier about your German friend coming early, if you go for a cross-cultural training, they may tell you that German people tend to be on time, very punctual, and so on, but it won't tell you how to deal with the fact that your friends may show up 15 minutes at a party, whereas the rest of the group, who is not German, will show up 15 minutes late. So these are the type of work that we do in cultural intelligence. We help people resolve or come up with better strategies to resolve those cross-cultural conflicts. And what we like to do is to tell people it's not all about adapting. I mean, if I'm French, if I go to America, I'm not going to become American. It's not possible. I don't have the upbringing. I don't have I don't know all the very subtle and I mean, my mind doesn't work the same way, and it's hard for me to change that. So the type of training that are more important that needs to be added to those training on language and cultural do's and don'ts is really thinking of what can people do to create solutions that satisfy their own culture and also satisfy the culture of the other person. So your idea of you trying to be prepared for everybody, then it's an example of cultural adaptation that works in that particular situation. Yeah.
That's a good point. Like finding a sort of middle ground, something that works for your culture and for the other person's culture, rather than one or the other. That's a really interesting point.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Well, the last thing I really wanted to ask you about is you also researched the suspension of judgment in the intercultural interactions, and we've kind of alluded to it through our discussion. But do you have any tips on how we can suspend our judgment when we are having those interactions?
Yes, I think it starts from being mindful, being aware of ourselves. Suspension of judgment starts from knowing our own biases, knowing our own beliefs, our own stereotypes, our own ideas about other people. Because when we know what we think of others, when we know the stereotypes that we have of others, it becomes easier to catch them when they are at play. The reason why we need to suspend judgment is because when we encounter a situation that conflicts with our own worldview or that is different from the way we would normally do things, we have this automatic reaction of judging. Because it makes us uncomfortable. So what makes us uncomfortable, we tend to attach a judgment to it. The judgment is usually about the other person. This person is rude. This person is inefficient. This person is what and what and what. So to suspend judgment, we have to catch us when we have those thoughts. When we start having those negative thoughts about another person, suspending judgment means that, hey, wait a minute. Is this person really rude? Is this person really inefficient? Or is it the culture? Is it the way they do things where she comes from? You know, hey, maybe there's some value to it. Maybe there's something to learn here. So suspension of judgment is this. It's about catching those moments where we have those negative thoughts about another person. We start judging them and taking a step back. And going back to think about our own biases. Hey, why do I feel so uncomfortable when this person arrives early to my party? Because I had an expectation that people will arrive 15 minutes late. So when we start understanding our thought process, what happens in our own mind, based on our own beliefs, our own values, our own stereotype of others, then it becomes easier and easier to suspend this judgment, to catch ourselves where we start having those negative ideas, these negative judgments about other people.
Yeah, that's a really great point. Well, and I appreciate that feedback. I mentioned a couple of times during the podcast that you're just finishing your PhD, and of course, congratulations. I know you've been working on it for quite a number of years. I'm curious, what's coming up next for you? Are you going to continue to work at the university, or is there something, I mean, what's sort of your dream job to take this to the next level?
So for now, we plan to stay in Singapore, so I will continue teaching at the university.
Great.
I really enjoy teaching. Teaching for me it's a way to share this knowledge and also to really see an impact. Because as I say, cultural intelligence is a skill. It's something you practice and you develop. And when we teach a long-term course over several weeks, we can really see an impact. We can really see a change in the way people think. We can see them becoming more aware, developing an awareness of themselves, of others, of things that they had never thought of before. So I'm very passionate about teaching, and I plan to continue for now. What will happen next, I don't know. I'm in Singapore for now, but we may move around. I'm open to live to another country, to start again in another place. Very interested to learn about other culture. Maybe, one day we will come to the U.S.
Right, that would be fantastic.
So,
I will say the one other person that I knew in Singapore, he moved to Nashville, so he's just a few hours away in Tennessee now. So if you wanted to move to Tennessee.
Oh, wow. I would like that.
Right. He moved here maybe 2 years ago or something. So not long after I visited, he moved to Tennessee, which was quite funny. Yeah.
Oh.
Well, is there a place where listeners can go to learn more about you or your work?
So I would recommend listeners to go to the website of the Center for Leadership and Cultural Intelligence at NTU. The website is www.clci.ntu.edu.sg. There they will learn more about the work that we do, the courses that we teach, the knowledge that we share. People can also contact me by email at Catherine.Peyrols, Peyrols, angela.copeland@gmail.com. I'm happy to answer the email. That's about it.
Fantastic. Well, I will put a link to the website in the show notes so that everyone can visit very easily. And Catherine, thank you so much for joining me. This discussion has been great, and I know that it's 6 a.m. for you tomorrow, and I really appreciate you getting up and sharing all this information with us.
Thank you, Angela.
Thanks, everyone, for listening, and thank you to those who sent me questions. You can send me your questions to angela@copelandcoaching.com. You can also send me questions via Twitter. I'm @CopelandCoach, and on Facebook, I'm Copeland Coaching. Don't forget to help me out. Subscribe on iTunes or Stitcher and leave me a review.
Thank you for listening to the Copeland Coaching Podcast today with your host, Angela Copeland. Tune in next time to get more great tips on turning your job search into a slam dunk.